On behalf of the Society, I want to welcome everyone to our 10th anniversary celebration. It was 10 years ago that a group of Newark historians got together and, trying to pay tribute to the late Dr. Paul Stellhorn, we felt that we wanted to have some sort of organization. And it was our featured speaker, Dr. Ken Jackson, who suggested that Newark is the largest city in America without its own historical society. So based on that, we got together and we founded our Historic Society. I'd like, for an official greeting from the city of Newark, I'd like our Mayor, Cory Booker, to step up and say hello.
Hello. Thank you, everybody. This is the profound sense of gratitude I feel to this community of people who are keeping our city connected to its roots. It's how we're fortified, it's how we're nourished. And without our roots and without that connection, without that understanding, without the revelation of what history is, we would be a city that has, without a rudder, we'd be a city without its essence. And so I just feel a sense of a humble gratitude to everyone, and I want to get out of the way and let the historians speak. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm not down at the Rock tonight, but I'm happy to say that people interested in Newark history are a significant minority of those who are interested in Bruce Springsteen. Newark History Society is a all-volunteer organization. We have no offices, we have no paid staff. What we do have is a 9-member board of trustees. And those trustees plan, organize, and execute all of our programs. We've had 43 of those programs. Actually, this is the 44th over the 10 years. And if you look at the posters all around this room, they represent all of our programs. You'll see how varied and interesting the sessions of the Newark History Society have been. But it's the trustees that make us viable. It's their expertise, their knowledge, their passion for Newark that really motivates everything we do. I'd like them to stand as I introduce them. First, our president, Tim Christ. Dr. Dan Flaherty. Dr. Gail Momgreen. Walter Chambers. Guy Sterling. Tom McCabe. And our newest member, Mark Krasovich. I also would like to recognize the representatives of the 3 groups that from the beginning have sponsored it, have helped us, have given us their expertise. First of all, Rutgers Newark's Chancellor, Philip Yeagle. Newark Library Director, Wilma Gray. New Jersey Historical Society Executive Director, Steve Tetamonte. There are also individuals who have helped us from our very beginning. Some of those were at the original meeting where we set everything up and give us enormous support all the time. First of all, Dr. Clem Price. Dr. Victor Parsonet. George Robb. I'd also like to thank City Clerk Bob Marasco, who supplies all of the videotaping, and that's how we're on Channel 78. After each program, they do about 4 or 5 different sessions of our meetings. Dr. Tim Christ is our president. He's a co-founder of the Newark History Society. He's been a student of Newark history since he first moved to Newark 3 decades ago. Building on his doctoral research at Cambridge University, he has presented 2 fantastic talks to this society. One on Newark's establishment as a Puritan settlement, and one about Newark in the 1750s. Since we're meeting at the Newark Public Library, it's important to note that Tim serves as president of the library's Board of Trustees. Tim will give us a history and overview of the Newark History Society. I very proudly present Dr. Tim Christ.
Well, anniversaries are important events. They help us remember why an organization got started in the first place, and they challenge us to take a fresh look at future direction. And I sometimes think that human beings are hardwired to celebrate anniversaries because we're doing it all the time. A few years ago, the Newark Museum celebrated its 100th anniversary. Last year, Mayor Booker led the city in a celebration of its 175th anniversary of incorporation as a municipality. And the library is preparing for its 125th anniversary celebration of opening its doors to the public in 1889. And in just 4 years, we're only 4 years away from the 350th anniversary of the founding of Newark in 1666 by a remarkable group of Puritans from New Haven Colony. So tonight we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Newark History Society, and I suppose it's a bit presumptuous for us to celebrate the founding after only 10 years, but I think some of us aren't sure we're going to be around when we hit 15 or 20 or 25. But we too can benefit from looking at what we've accomplished and challenging ourselves to think about what we want to do going forward. So we're delighted that you've joined us for this 10th anniversary celebration. As I look back, I realize that one tragic event led to the creation of the Newark History Society, and then we had to survive a second tragic event just to keep going. The first event was the sudden death of Paul Stellhorn at much too young an age in January 2001. Paul was a fine historian with a special interest in Newark, and he spent his whole career at the intersection of scholarship and the public humanities, first at the New Jersey Historical Commission, then at the New Jersey Committee for the Humanities, and finally for 13 years here at the Newark Public Library. Within 2 weeks of Paul's death, Warren Grover, Charles Cummings, and I met to discuss what we could do to honor him and to mark his legacy. Warren was then putting the finishing touches on his groundbreaking study of fascism and the response to fascism in Newark that was later published as Nazis in Newark. And Charles, of course, was the beloved keeper of the New Jersey collection here in this library and the official city historian of Newark. I don't recall who brought us together, but I suspect it was Warren. I didn't know Warren well in those days, although we've become close friends since then and surprisingly effective partners. Charles probably suggested including me. In this, as in so many things, Charles was the glue. But we didn't know that we would have to nurture the society without him following his untimely death in December 2005. The first idea that Warren, Charles, and I came up with was something that we called the Stellhorn Lecture Series on New Jersey and Urban History. We let that idea sit for a while, and then we shifted to talking about the Stellhorn Society for Newark History. We let that sit a little longer, and by December 2001, we had focused the mission and changed the name to the Newark History Society. We first went public in January 2002, a year after Paul's death, when we invited 30 to 40 distinguished Newarkers, including several here tonight, to an organizational meeting. We made it clear that our goal was not to replace or compete with any group in town, but rather to complement and to supplement their efforts. We said that we hope to avoid the twin dangers of doing too much, such as establishing a new institution and staffing it, or doing too little, such as sponsoring an event and then scattering. We wanted to find ways to contribute to civic life in Newark, and we said that we would seek and encourage partnerships such as those that we have since established with Rutgers Newark, the New Jersey Historical Society, and the Newark Public Library. By October 2002, we were ready to sponsor our first public program on the Greek community in Newark. The flyer for that's over there. That was followed quickly in December 2002 by perhaps one of our liveliest programs yet on the 1971 teachers' strikes. At that first public event in October 2002, 55 people signed up as members and paid their $25 dues. And over the last decade, we've more than tripled that membership while keeping our dues at $25. And as Warren said from the beginning, we've been a volunteer-led organization, and our only program and operational support has come from our members. And while we received several grants for our Newark Archives project, we've never asked for or received grants from companies or foundations or public agencies for any of our public programs. So I encourage those of you who are here tonight who aren't yet members to take the slip of paper that was on your chair and to join us in supporting the Newark History Society. We invite your participation and we rely on your support. I look at what the Newark History Society has accomplished over the last 10 years and frankly I'm astonished. A lot of that's due to Warren Grover. I'm not sure what he had in mind when he suggested that I serve as president and he as secretary, but I had an organizational model in mind in which the secretary does most of the work. But it's turned out that we've split the task pretty evenly, and Warren, I think between us we've stuffed, sealed, and stamped over 10,000 envelopes with our program flyers over the last decade. We've also assembled our executive committee, whom Warren introduced. And every now and again, we all meet over dinner to talk about future programs and to decide who will take the lead in organizing each program. But if we've been successful as an organization, I think we have been, it's because we've kept it simple and we've kept it focused on Newark. We've put on some special programs, and if you look at these are enlargements of the flyers that we sent out. If you look at these posters around this room, you get a sense of what we've done. We received wonderful support from our panelists and speakers, and we've tapped into a deep reservoir of interest in what's happened in Newark, why it took place here, and why it's important. And we've never made the size of our audience the measure of our success, but I'm constantly surprised by how many people turn up. For example, 6 weeks ago where's Gail? There's Gail. When Gail Malmgreen presented a program about our Newark Archives project, over 100 people, with standing room only at the New Jersey Historical Society, came for her presentation. And later this year, in partnership for Rutgers Newark, we will go live with a searchable online database with descriptions of documentary and archival materials related to Newark history. And this database, to our understanding, will be the first of its kind created anywhere, focused solely on the history of a single city. And it will continue to grow as Gail and her colleague Alex, who's sitting right behind her, continue to survey more collections. And while it's not an explicit goal of our project, we do expect to channel donations of archival materials to this library, to the Historical Society, Metro West, and other repositories, building on several such donations in recent years. And Bob Hartman, and Bob was supposed to, there he is, Bob Hartman, who has done such a great job designing all these flyers, as well as the invitation for tonight's program and this flyer for the Newark Archives project. Bob has also designed a website for us, and we hope to have that up and running this summer. It will include information on all these programs that have taken place, along with the text of several of the presentations. And tonight we're making good on that original aim of honoring Paul Stellhorn, and we printed copies of Clem Price's talk, which he did at that original organizational meeting in October 2002. They were on the tables outside. Some of you may have walked past them, but do pick up a copy on your way out. And we've also called Professor Jackson's talk the Paul Stellhorn Lecture. At our first organizational meeting in January 2002, I asked a rhetorical question. What does it mean to focus on Newark history? I suggested that it meant encouraging the conditions under which history can take place. And that's what we've done over the last 10 years. We've encouraged people to study and research into Newark's long and varied history and to explore its remarkable texture and diversity. We provided opportunities for people to present their research, reflect on their own experience of different events, and discuss what it all means. We've drawn in scholars, but we haven't limited ourselves to academics. We're convinced that history is most vibrant when there's a dialogue that takes place at the intersection of scholarship and the public square. And with our Newark Archives project, we'll help everybody with an interest in Newark's history find primary materials to inform their work. And after tonight, our programs will continue next fall. And I'm looking for Bob Curvin now. There's Bob. Bob is going to give a talk, date to be determined, next September, about Newark in the 1960s, which is his first discussion of the book that he's working on. And then Warren Grover is going to give a talk about communists in Newark. And then we're planning a panel discussion about the administration of Mayor Leo Carlin. And if there's anything we've learned over the last 10 years, it's that there's no lack of Newark topics to explore once you start paying attention. So with your continuing support, we look forward to many more years of helping history take place in Newark. Thank you.
About 4 months ago, we sat down, the executive committee. There were 8 of us then, and we decided that we were going to award a distinguished Newark historian award for the Newark History Society. So the question was, who? We looked around, one name. Not 2, not 3, just one. And of course, Clem was our choice. To present the award, a fellow trustee, Walter Chambers, who himself is part of Newark's illustrious past. He was born and raised in Newark. He worked for many years for New Jersey Bell, now Verizon, retired as an assistant vice president. His main extracurricular activity in the 50s was as assistant director on Mayor Leo P. Carlin's commission on group relations. A real Newarker, Walt Chambers.
Warren, that was a job at the commission. I got paid. Not much, but I got paid. Tonight, the Newark History Society is proud to present our Outstanding Newark Scholar Award to Professor Clement Price of Rutgers, Newark. Clement Price is well known to this audience, but it's worth reminding you that his interest in Newark was sparked even before he came to New Jersey 44 years ago. He was finishing up a master's thesis at the University of Bridgeport on urban racial violence in the 20th century and took a job in 1968, probably getting more than I, at the recently opened Essex County College. His interest in Newark and New Jersey history broadened while he was a PhD student in history at Rutgers, at a time when Professor Richard P. McCormick's influence on graduate studies at Rutgers was at an all-time high. Through his dissertation research on the emergence of Newark's 20th century African-American community and his publications on Newark's complicated history of race relations, Clem has demonstrated both thorough research and deep insight. And through his course at Rutgers on the history of Newark and his many efforts to weave the history of Newark into the civic fabric of the city, Clem has shown an unfailing willingness to share his scholarship with others and to encourage public discourse. Now, sir, if you'll just join me here. So it is with deep respect for your scholarship and with gratitude for your support of the Newark History Society, we are very proud to present to you our very first Outstanding Newark Scholar Award. And just a word about this award, in addition to being the first, it is also unique in its design, so you have to get him to show you, because it was designed and executed by our fellow executive committee member, Guy Sterling. So then, congratulations, Clem, on being our outstanding scholar.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to the trustees of the Newark History Society. Newark has been very generous to Mary Sue and me over the years. Awards, accolades, salutes, but this is very special, and I'll tell you why. When I was a kid, as a graduate student, I walked into the New Jersey room and Charles Cummings treated me as if I was John Hope Franklin. And I certainly wasn't John Hope Franklin then or now, but Charles treated me as such. And that mattered because when you're a graduate student, you quake in your boots for 4 or 5 years. And then if you're a lucky and healthy enough person, you prevail with a PhD. And Charles's mentorship was deep and abiding. So I want to first of all acknowledge the influence that Charles had, not just on me. As it turns out, Charles treats everybody like John Hope Franklin, as Professor Jackson and other distinguished scholars would note and remember. I want to acknowledge the Newark Museum. Long before Mary Sue and I became a couple, I was asked to give the first lecture in this city at the Newark Museum. And I think I've given more talks from that podium than anywhere else in Newark, or for that matter, elsewhere. And let me acknowledge the Newark Public Library, which served as a safe civic and intellectual haven over the years of my work. I should resist the temptation of talking about Ken Jackson, but I'm not, because I've said over the years, if you run into someone who has not read Ken Jackson and purports to know something about American cities and suburbs, or especially Newark, and if they have not read Ken Jackson, don't take them seriously. I said that to the mayor some years ago. And Mayor Booker draws from Ken's scholarship and the scholarship that stands on that scholarship. And I want to thank the mayor for being here. I texted Cory to see if he knew that Ken was in town, and he texted me back to say he was on his way. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, this award given by the society is especially meaningful because Newark's history has a future because of the society. When Paul Stellhorn and I were graduate students, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of students were doing New Jersey history because of Professor McCormick, who we knew affectionately as Mr. Rutgers. Once he grew older and stopped writing the program on the New Brunswick campus, the PhD program, which is a very distinguished program, moved away from New Jersey history, moved away from Newark history. This society, forged by historians and engaged citizens, has given the past a future. I mean, these programs, look at the remarkable vitality and profusion of programs. There may not be an American city that is digging into the weeds of its history as Newark has through the efforts of the society. So I want to thank the society for doing that. I want to thank Rutgers. I joined the Rutgers faculty. I was a kid. I was 23 years of age without a PhD, vulnerable because I was interested in doing what then was dismissively called local history. But the history of the city and the memory of the city mattered to me. And my colleagues at Rutgers, Jan Lewis, I'll start off with Jan, and others got it, that I really cared about where I worked and where I lived. So I want to thank Jan, who's now dean. And I want to thank Chancellor Phil Yeagle. Phil, thank you for being here, sir, as I would expect you would be, for all the right reasons. Let me just acknowledge a few people: Sherry Ann Butterfield, Mark Krosovic, Maxine and Jonathan Lurie, Tom McCain, Jane Latour, who I taught when I was in my teens, and she is here. Thank you, Jane, for being here. John Johnson, and of course, Bob and Pat Curvin, who've been like big brother and big sister to me over these years. I've said this before. If I were entrepreneurial, I would start a business in Newark that would make plaques, because this city loves to salute its engaged citizens, those who hold aloft the lantern of Newark. And I'm looking at Liz Del Tufo, who knows this to be true. But this award is very, very special to me, because history has consumed a good part of my life. And because Newark now has a credible history, it has a credible future. And we all know that to be true this evening. And last but certainly not least, and for all sorts of reasons, having to do with the kind of Newarkers we are. I want to thank my dear wife, Mary Sue, for being the lantern in my life, both home and abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clem. It's wonderful to know that Clem's Institute at Rutgers is now training master's degree candidates, doctoral degree candidates, and many of them are doing their work on Newark history. Actually, we can look forward, because of Clem's efforts and a few others, to have many, many works on Newark history coming out in the next decades. And I'm sure, as Clem mentioned, all those students, whether master's, doctoral, at Rutgers, are going to have to read Crabgrass Frontier. Dan O'Flaherty, fellow trustee, a longtime Newark activist, is currently on the boards of Unified Vailsburg Service Organization, Newark Emergency Service for Families, and he's an advisor to the Newark Water Group. In the past, he has been acting director of finance for the city of Newark, and he's been on the Newark Fair Taxation Committee. Dan will introduce Ken Jackson for the Paul Stellhorn lecture.
Thank you, Warren. I think Clem has done the beginning of the introduction, so I can not make it too long. It's pretty easy to introduce Ken Jackson, because all you have to say is what he did, and it sounds great. Ken is the Jacques Barzun Professor of History and the Social Sciences at Columbia University. And he's an outstanding person in many, many dimensions. First, he's a great teacher. He teaches a course in local history that is not required to anyone, and it's legendary. This course draws about 400 students every year, year in, year out, which is as big, there is no room that holds more than 400 students at Columbia. What you have to realize about this accomplishment is that Ken does this under a huge handicap. The huge handicap is that this course has to be the history of the city of New York. Think of what he could do with the history of the city of Newark. Ken is also a distinguished author and researcher. I gather from looking at all of his publications that if he misses a train, he writes a book. The most outstanding two publications are Crabgrass Frontier, which has won every award and that everybody has to read, and the Encyclopedia of the City of New York, which he didn't write while waiting for a train. For those of you who are younger than I am, Ken has 3 Wikipedia entries. There's a Ken Jackson entry, there's a Crabgrass Frontier entry, and there's an Encyclopedia of the City of New York entry. Very few people have 3. That's okay. He's a former president of the Urban History Society. He is a former president of the New York Historical Society. Watch out, Tim. As former president of the Urban History Association, I was looking at, academics like to give awards for things, and looking at distinguished awards. I was wondering if Ken had ever won an award from the Urban History Association. Answer is no. The only thing that the Urban History Association has done to recognize Ken is that their major award, the award for the best book every year in urban history, just happens to be called the Ken Jackson Award. So he's a great teacher. He's also, to me, has been an example of what a professor should be. In any job, you come as the young folks, and you want to see what the experienced people do. And I've had the great honor and privilege of being able to watch Ken in action and try to learn how to imitate him. I think the most outstanding thing about Ken is what an amazingly helpful and kind person he is. Clem has talked about what it is like to be a graduate student. I guess this is my defining anecdote of Ken. In the mid-90s or so, before there was email, there was a graduate student who was working with Ken who really, really needed to see Stan Winters and hadn't really arranged a good way to talk to Stan Winters. So one day I noticed that Warren was holding a conference in honor of Stan Winters at Metro West. And I was busy, and this was a graduate student in another department, and this was the days of voicemail. So rather than doing anything meaningful, rather than doing anything that I think would work, I pick up the phone and I leave a voicemail message for Ken that there's this thing at Metro West at such and such a time, and wouldn't it be good if this graduate student got there? And I figure, okay, this is the Jacques Barzun professor of history, is the most, and I'm using him to send a message to a graduate student. So this is ridiculous, but it's off my conscience now. It's not going to happen. It's off my conscience. So I get there. A couple minutes after I get there, I turn around and I see coming into the parking lot the famous Jackson land boat. And not only did he tell the graduate student that he really ought to get out there and see Stan Winters, he picked him up and he drove him there. So I did not take that as an example of what professors are supposed to do. There's a limit of being a good example that's taken seriously. So it is tonight really a great, great honor that Ken is going to give this Paul Stellhorn lecture to us and for us, but it's much more than an honor. This is Ken Jackson. This is going to be good.
If you believe all the nonsense that you've just been told, I'll talk to you about some real estate. But a lot of people have said what an honor it is, but it is an honor to be at the 10th anniversary of this organization. And just read the programs around the room of what has been accomplished, and it's stunning in its diversity and its thoroughness, the numbers of people who have been involved. I also knew Paul Stellhorn, and to be the first Paul Stellhorn lecturer is terrific. And Clement Price, who's been honored here tonight, has been a very long-time friend and mentor to me as well as to everyone else who's interested in Newark. And I'm also intimidated because I know that half 100 people in this room have forgotten more about Newark than I will ever know. So what the hell am I doing up here? But there is an old saying that he knows not England who only England knows. And so I guess what I can maybe bring is a broader perspective, because I've spent my whole life looking at cities. And I'm hoping that we will have time for some criticism and comment and discussion afterwards. So I'll take the watch off. We live in an era of great cities. In 1900, for example, only 14% of the Earth's population lived in cities. In 2010, more than half of a much larger population now calls some city home. And the bigger, the bigger, the bigger. London, Paris, Tokyo have recently been joined by places that we had not earlier much heard about, like Nairobi, Manila, Bangkok, Taipei, and Mumbai. As peasants everywhere move away from farms toward the promise of urban living even when that promise begins with shanties and filth and crime and discrimination. Examples are everywhere apparent. Mexico City, founded in the 16th century, had fewer than 350,000 people as late as 1900. It was only a tenth the size of New York City. 2010, the Mexican capital has more than 20 million inhabitants. Sao Paulo, similar story, relatively small place in 1900. About 2010, and it becomes South America's largest metropolis, and we could talk on and on about other cities that have grown large. But my talk tonight does not focus on the phenomenon of rapid urban growth, but the slow decline of some cities in population, economic activity, and even in social, political, and cultural significance. By some estimates, 1/5 or 1/6 of all the cities on this planet are in decline, either in density or in total population or both, in the second decade of the 21st century. And the numbers of such places will only grow as the national populations of countries as diverse as Russia, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Ukraine, and possibly even China begin to decline. These shrinking cities are characterized by a loss in the number and quality of jobs, sometimes by the almost complete evaporation of the economic foundation of the area. In some respects, the United States is the poster child of this phenomenon. Although the population of the country more than doubled from 150 million in 1950 to 310 million in 2010, many of its cities did not share in the prosperity. New York State is a case in point. In 1900, as in 1940 and 1950, the Empire State was unquestionably #1 in the nation in population, wealth, and political influence. It had a dozen important cities, most of them located along the Erie Canal. Think of it: Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Schenectady, Albany, and Troy. All are shrinking in the 21st century. We do not need to limit ourselves to New York. St. Louis makes a good example. Once the 4th largest city in the United States, the gateway to the West, is no longer in the top 50. In 1950, it had 857,000 residents. In 2010, just a few more than 300,000. A particularly telling statistic is that St. Louis has long been a major exporter of used bricks, which are destined to be used in patios or restoration projects in growing cities, like Atlanta or Houston. In some ways, it's the supreme indignity, having lost 1,000 factories to the Sun Belt or to the developing world since 1950. St. Louis is now in the process of itself being carried away. The story of Newark is a similar way, in some ways, maybe an American tragedy. It's the story, similarly, of St. Louis and Cincinnati and Cleveland and Detroit. And Newark became a great city early in the 20th century when, to all appearances, America was becoming a nation of great cities. Newspapers and magazines lauded urban centers as the core of the nation's economic, cultural, and political development. Such was the case into the 1950s. But by 2000, if not before, a nation of cities had become a nation of suburbs. Cities had morphed in the second half of the 20th century into places of despair, subsidy, often criminality, and decay. So Newark is clearly not alone, but is an example of a whole category of cities. Newark study, its story is obviously more complex and complicated than I can survey this afternoon. But in 1900, this city was headed for greatness. It had a rich economic infrastructure, a buoyant downtown, a perfect cross-section of ethnic and racial diversity, a terrific location on the busiest rail corridor in the nation, and the greatest port in the Western Hemisphere. This talk is about how one of America's most prosperous and largest cities became one of the poorest and most dysfunctional. It's the story of what happens when the elements that make a great city fail one by one. The failure was profound in many ways, and I do not mean to oversimplify them. But while this is a story of decay, it's also obviously not a story of death. Many good, intelligent, honest, ambitious people are engaged in 2012 in bringing this city back to vibrancy, restoring order, and encouraging economic development. But let's start with 1916, which has been already mentioned, the 250th anniversary of the city. It was as grand a day as any American city could hope for. Secretary of War Newton Baker stepped off the train at Newark's Pennsylvania station at 3 p.m. on May 13, 1916, where he was met by the Essex troop, which escorted him to the nearby Robert Treat Hotel just across the park. Filling in for President Woodrow Wilson, a friend of Newark who was detained in Washington, the Secretary of War came to open Newark's Industrial Exposition and to celebrate the city's 250th anniversary. And by the way, third in the United States to New York and Boston, not counting Jamestown, at which nobody ever lived much, or Williamsburg, or Plymouth Plantation, which are St. Augustine, which are fake cities. We're talking real cities here. By the way, you go to Jamestown, you know how many people live there? One. An archaeologist digging around looking for it. We call it the first permanent English settlement. I mean, I don't get that, permanent. Try to go there and spend the night. But anyway, that's another story. After checking into the new Robert Treat Hotel, the secretary crossed the street, obviously, to Military Park, where he dedicated the granite seat given by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and talked about how Newark was the city of the future. He says, there's a quote, "An entirely different phase has come over our age. In no place to a greater extent than Newark represents that change. From modest roots as farmers, Americans had become enmeshed in the, quote, whirl of the wheel of industry and the smoke of the factory. Men live in better houses, have cleaner and better streets, build great schoolhouses, and cultivate the great virtues which in a city like this are vital to the preservation both of our freedom and usefulness of our country." At 4:50 p.m., Baker went to the exposition where he flipped a switch which first put the current into thousands of globes illuminating the transformed 1st Regiment Armory. That was a great month. That day, exactly 96 years ago this month. A laudatory article a week earlier had celebrated the city's assets, attractive, venerable, and at the same time progressive. For an industrial community of magnitude, it has beauty and attractiveness of its own. We have become a metropolis without ceasing to be provincial in the good sense of having something of the intimacy of village life. At the end of May, 40,000 Newarkers celebrated the founding of the city 250 years earlier with a grand pageant in Wequahic Park. 4,000 performers 92 of them had speaking parts. Watched Robert Treat negotiate with the Indians, George Washington come, Abraham Lincoln. Whenever you're depressed, thank yourself that you were not in the audience that day. Anyway, Newark, of course, did not fulfill its great promise. In 1890, it had become a major center for banking, insurance, legal, and government services. The Prudential Insurance Company you know about, Ballantine Brewing right next door, just about, or at least the home of the brewer, became one of the largest single enterprises in the Northeast. By the turn of the century, more than 90% of the patent leather in the United States was produced in Newark. The city was a leader in trunk manufacture and drugs and chemicals, electrical machinery, jewelry, varnish and paint manufacture. And of course, the city continued to grow into the 1940s. Its population rose to 450,000, at one time 8th largest in the United States. Port Newark opens in 1915, Newark Airport in 1928, and the Grand Newark, Pennsylvania station in 1935. By 1931, both the airport and the intersection, as you have heard, of Broad and Market Streets were at least touted as the busiest in the world. And there were big department stores, elegant movie theaters, such outstanding cultural institutions of the Newark Museum and this Newark Public Library, the cherry blossoms and shade trees of Branch Brook Park, the gracious houses along High Street, around Military and Washington Parks, were as attractive as anywhere. Newark boasted of exciting nightclubs and of sports teams that were legendary. You know, the 1937 Newark Bears baseball team is widely regarded as the finest minor league club of all time. And there was a huge Thanksgiving parade here that would attract as many as 500,000 people, sponsored by Bambergers. And so this is in the 40s. I saw one really picture. I was going to show, I had a visual presentation, but the room is not shaped for it. But you can see this gigantic parade going on just outside this building. Optimism was the air. There was a 1925 futuristic portrait of Newark, for example, predicted that by 1975, the central business district here would be as prominent as any on earth, and would be chock-a-block with impressive skyscrapers. In fact, as late as the 1930s, Princeton economist James G. Smith predicted that Newark potential comparable to the phenomenal growth of Los Angeles. Well, didn't work out quite that way. In fact, we remember that in 1970, the comment allegedly made by Kenneth Gibson, somebody around him, wherever Newark, urban America is going, Newark will get there first. I think it also tells us a lot about 1970. The assumption is that cities are all going to hell. That's just inevitable. It's going to happen if we just play it out. And Newark was in some ways leading the pack. It was a prescient comment anyway, by whoever made it. By the turn of the 21st century, the city only had a little more than half the residents it had 50 years earlier. The job loss was stark. Some firms, like the Ballantine Brewery, just closed its doors. Others, like the Spring Air Mattress Company or the Barton Press, just moved out of town. And others, like Prudential, technically remained in Newark but moved many operations to other locations. In the end, however, some of these facts are less revealing than individual experience. For example, Philip Roth's famous novel, Goodbye Columbus, was written in the 1950s when the Jewish exodus from Newark was reaching its peak. The journey west toward, well, Metro West was mentioned. The journey west was toward the, quote, promised land, which in terms of the protagonist, Neil Klagman, meant suburban Short Hills, where Brenda Potamkin lived. Similarly, in 1991, when the South Orange High School class of 61, they had its 30th reunion, one young woman publicly thanked her parents for getting her out of Newark in the 1950s. And then in 1967, there were the disturbances, which were famous around the country. The question here, why? The usual academic explanations for the decline of Newark or Cleveland or St. Louis or anywhere else, and I've been part of that, say that there are at least 4 huge factors that do in fact impact every city. We're all Americans. One would be racism. No one here need be reminded that we have a long history of racial prejudice, and where the color line has been an important thing. And certainly it was, most people would say, was just about as severe in the North as it was in the South. By the way, you hear a Memphis accent here. I'll talk about it in just a second. Been here a long time, but held on to that accent, but whatever. But one would be racism. Another is deindustrialization. I mean, we know that Newark was one of America's great industrial cities. But can we think of a city where the industries didn't pick up? First, sometimes to the suburbs, then to South Carolina, now to Indonesia, where else? It's just, maybe it's going to turn around, we don't know, but certainly it's a phenomenon hardly unique to Newark, New Jersey. Cheap houses, cheap roads, cheap gasoline. By that, what I mean is the suburban push in the United States. More so than any place else on earth, maybe Australia. It was easy and inexpensive for us to move out, to go somewhere else, because of our unusual way of building houses with popsicle sticks, called 2x4s, on land that's much less expensive than it is in Germany or Switzerland or France or somewhere else. And with gasoline that is still, actually it's cheaper in New Jersey than almost anywhere else, but still even in New York and California, cheap by world standards. So we won't argue that now, but it's about the same as it was when I was a kid. It was 30 cents. It's just that everything else is inflated. But those have affected everybody in any American city. Not unique to Newark, New Jersey. And then finally, the federal government has had something to do with the way we live in 2 or 3 ways, but one would be the Federal Housing Administration, which decided to make loans available or guarantee loans to American people. Good program. Made it possible to get mortgages if you were here in Newark. Buy a house, guaranteed by the FHA would guarantee your bank that if you reneged, they would pick it up. So the bank was without risk. The Veterans Administration followed more or less the same programs. So we built all around the United States, places like Levittown, new mass-produced suburbs, where the purchase price was often later lower than the rental price. You got a front yard, a backyard, a Bendix washer. What's not to like about this picture? That's, well, if you weren't black, because they did implicitly and explicitly say this is for whites. So that's a problem for Newark. They also said, and this is in the federal guidelines for FHA, straight streets, a gridiron pattern, is not desirable. We need curving streets. Well, do you have many curving streets here in Newark or in Camden or somewhere else? That's not good. Or mixed uses. A mixed use might mean a delicatessen on the corner. Jane Jacobs wrote a famous book, The Death of, who says that's great. But that's not what they thought, that we need to segregate the houses over here and the stores over here and the schools over here and the factories over here. Well, in Newark, you had mixed uses. And then the final blow was inharmonious racial or nationality groups. They rated every neighborhood. Quality of houses, cost of the rent, the way they were holding up. Any Jews nearby, Italians, you can't really be first class if you're not 100% American. So even places like the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, which was really fancy in the 1930s, couldn't really be a green color because Jews lived there. Blacks, not only were all black neighborhoods automatically red, but even if they were nearby, some of the best studies of racial movement is done by the FHA, trying to study all this sort of stuff. Anyway, long and short of it was the federal government helped finance the movement of GIs and lots of other people to the suburbs, all around the country. I happen to know a lot about Newark because I just stumbled into the Essex County records, and if during the discussion you want to talk about it, I can tell you that these secret federal files were in fact available to Essex County financial institutions, because they would say in questionnaires, where will you make loans? They'd say A and B only, or green and blue, not yellow and red, or whatever. Anyway, they obviously were spread around. Anyway, I don't want to make this a point about that subject, except to say, obviously Newark is part of the United States. We live in some ways in an anti-urban culture. I'm not the first person to say that, but that's where we are. And I'm not going to take it because one of my students, Tom Sugru, wrote a really good book about Detroit called The Origins of the Urban Crisis, when he talks about a lot of this stuff. We're all subject to forces larger than ourselves. But national patterns do not tell us everything. They do not explain why a white man from Mississippi, Charles Cummings, whose name is on the New Jersey reference room above us, just till the recent PhD from Vanderbilt, wanders into this building about 40 years ago and never leaves. As surely as any man ever loved a woman, Charles Cummings loved Newark. And for better or for worse, and for richer or poor, he was a cheerleader for this city. I mean, in the darkest days of the 1970s and 1980s, Charles Cummings only had good things to say. What a rich subject for study. What an incredible place this was. Never wavered. Larger patterns don't tell us why somebody like that does that, but he did it. Or that Bob Kervin and Patricia, person of great PhD from Princeton, vice president of the Ford Foundation, New York Times editorial board, would stay in Newark rather than follow that black middle class exodus also to the suburbs. Or for that matter, our honoree tonight, Clement Price and Mary Sue. So obviously, I don't mean to say that it's obvious that local people and local decisions are important. But my thesis tonight is that we can't blame it all on other people. We can't blame it all on other forces. That both for good and for ill, local officials make decisions that have consequences. That federal housing policy, federal highway policy doesn't explain everything. Let me take the remaining time to make my argument here. Newark has not lacked always for great leaders. John Cotton Dana, I think there's somewhere there was a session around here to him. We've got the library named for him at the Rutgers Newark campus. He was one of the great cultural figures of the United States at the turn of the century. I think he founded the Newark Museum, headed this library, but it was what he thought. You know, he wanted to bring culture to the people, not just have exhibitions that would appeal to an elite. Anyway, huge. Or what about Mr. Bamberger? Bamberger's was apparently like the third or fourth biggest selling department store. I mean, obviously Macy's were first. Have you ever been to Detroit or Hudson's? You ever see Hudson's? Or Marshall Field in Chicago? That was the race that Bamberger was in. So he was obviously a major player. And I think it may be one of the tragedies of Newark that Mr. Bamberger died in 1944 at age 52. What if he had lived to be 82? Which would have been expected. I mean, somebody who was a civic leader and who might have been the focus of an effort to help Newark when it really needed it. But Newark, I think, has not had enough of those people. And so the city, I'm going to argue, has suffered from a lack of inspired and intelligent leadership for most of the past century. And what do I exactly mean about this? One would be a failure to, so I'm going to go back a long way and talk about something you all know about, which is the failure to annex. All great American cities expanded their boundaries and got bigger. In some ways, except Newark, which in some ways is smaller now than it used to be. And there was an effort to try. It makes a difference, as the mayor understands better than I, where the boundaries are. I was just reading in the paper the other day that a city in Chongqing has 29.2 million people. I thought, God, 29 million people in a city? And then it said the city had built 52,000 miles of highway in the last 7 years. I'm trying to think, New Jersey couldn't build 52,000. So the boundaries must be, you know, thousands of square miles. We only have 23 here in Newark. So territory is important in a way that it's not important in the rest of the world. In most of the world, police, schools, fire departments are responsibilities of governments bigger than local government. In the United States, we may have a lot more attack aircraft carriers than any place in the world and more power, but we have a very decentralized nation. And where power is at the local level and it's dispersed and balkanized, and no place in the world more balkanized than the state of New Jersey, which has consequences. It has consequences especially because annexation didn't work here. They might have gotten it back. In 1869, Newark added Clinton to its boundaries. In 1871, added Woodside. The remainder of Clinton followed in 1897 and 1902. Vailsburg became part of Newark in 1905. That ended the era of Newark expansion. While other ambitious American cities were turning suburbs into neighborhoods, Newark remained stuck at 23 square miles. Even St. Louis and San Francisco, the smallest of other American major cities, became twice as large as Newark. The public policy failure was also the result of public leadership. During the 1890s, for example, at least according to my knowledge, adjacent Harrison and Kearny were willing to join Newark. But the mayor and council delayed and fussed around. And by the time their annexation plans had solidified, the two Hudson County towns had industrial strength of their own and spurned Newark's marriage proposal. Still, Newark's leaders were confident. In 1900, the mayor, not foreseeing the day when his booming city would be surrounded by hostile suburbs, said East Orange, Vailsburg, Harrison, Kearny, Belleville would be desirable acquisitions. By an exercise of discretion, we can enlarge our city from decade to decade without unnecessarily taxing the property within our limits, which has clearly already paid the cost of public improvements. But the wish did not father the fact. Essex County came to be filled with small, independent municipalities, as you well know. Maplewood, Glen Ridge, Milburn, Caldwell, Montclair, Irvington, Nutley, the Oranges, that might otherwise have been neighborhoods in Newark. Thus, when wealthy and middle-class Newarkers began moving away from central cities, as they did all around the United States, they took with them their tax dollars to independent suburbs. Paul Stellhorn, whose name we honor tonight, his dissertation was on the Newark Chamber of Commerce. And he pointed out that by the 1920s, more than half the members of the Newark Chamber of Commerce had already headed for the hills. As Frank Kingdon gloomily noted in 1936, quote, "The more people with money move into residential areas outside the city, the less money will be available from highly assessed properties and for privately maintained social agencies. Either the city will have to maintain such agencies, or else it will pay a heavier bill for crime. In either cases, taxes will rise. As taxes rise, businesses will move to avoid them. And of course, the situation was just as costly for African Americans. For those black Newarkers who experienced financial success and bought larger homes, their quest quickly took them to places outside the city's boundaries, often to East Orange. Thus, their leadership skills were lost to those who remained behind. A second leadership failure in Newark was strong land use control. Unlike most suburbs, which excluded industries, and unlike many other cities, which typically required more cleanup efforts from polluting factories, Newark allowed obnoxious enterprises to coexist in proximity to residential neighborhoods. Leather goods, for example, and tanning, paint and varnish manufacture, and all brewing, they all caused environmental problems. Newark became associated in the public or middle class mind with problems, often with environmental problems, and I could quote more on that, but I want to have a discussion, so I'm skipping all that. You know what I was going to say. Industries were poisoning the inhabitants, certainly by the 1890s and before. Industrial pollution increased in the 20th century as chemical plants increased in complexity and size. During World War I, for example, Newark's famed reputation for making almost everything brought to the city a variety of military contracts for hardware, munitions, paint, clothing, uniforms, machine parts, and truck components, the production of all of which created toxic agents which found their way into the air or the ground. The problem continued into the modern era. One of the worst local polluters was the Diamond Alkali Company, which made pesticides along the Passaic River from 1951 to 1969, as well as the ingredients for the chemical defoliant Agent Orange. During the Vietnam War, when the firm was operating 24 hours a day, Diamond Alkali and other companies released dioxin, a cancer-causing compound that is a byproduct of chemical processing into the water, putting the lower Passaic River on the Environmental Protection Agency's list of the nation's most endangered waterways. I'll try to be quicker. I think it's not just a matter of the business leadership moving to the suburbs, but I think a little more than elsewhere, they did not maintain a strong urban presence here. The failure to make common cause with the black political leadership that was getting stronger. Let me just mention a couple of examples. Chicago and Detroit are pretty close together. And yet, if you think of the last 40 or 50, and Chicago is a big manufacturing center, bigger than Detroit, as a matter of fact. But when we think of the last 50 years, Detroit has become the poster child for urban pathologies, and Chicago not so much. So that both subject to some of the same, if we wanted to talk about the difference, what happened. Or I mentioned earlier, my hometown of Memphis. Memphis got on the wrong side of the civil rights revolution. We all remember that Martin Luther King was killed there in 1968. Talk about it just for a minute. The garbage men in Memphis, mostly black, in fact, probably all black, received less than minimum wage and no benefits and no retirement. But they went on strike because two of them got accidentally pulled into a truck, a garbage truck, and chewed to pieces. And so the garbage men went on strike, and Martin Luther King came to the city in support of that strike. And Mayor Henry Loeb refused to negotiate with the garbage men. Martin Luther King went away, the demonstrations continued. Henry Loeb refused to negotiate. Martin Luther King comes back. He's shot and killed. Memphis is described, I want to say in Time magazine, as a southern backwater. Think of Atlanta by contrast. In 1940, maybe as late as 1950, Atlanta and Memphis were almost in the same place, size-wise. You could have put your bets down either way. But think about Atlanta and what they did. City essentially called business and political leadership into a room, probably not as big as this, and said, well, we can go a couple ways. One is we can be like Little Rock or Birmingham and Bull Connor and become a laughingstock and an embarrassment. Or we can try to become a different kind of a city. And ultimately they coined the term a city too busy to hate. Now, in some ways, we all know that's a lot of nonsense. They're as racist in Atlanta as anywhere else. But perception is sometimes as important as reality. After Martin Luther King was killed, on the national networks, Mayor Henry Loeb of Memphis is seen face red with anger, blaming it on outside agitators. Same program. The mayor of Atlanta, Ivan Allen, is holding an umbrella for Coretta Scott King. Which city prospered? Local decision. Atlanta is now 5 times the size of Memphis, becoming the new home of Black America. By the way, another part of the story is apparently Ivan Allen was in Washington, I think visiting the president, and Bob Woodruff, the head of Coca-Cola, called him up and said, we need you back down here now, right now. But and he came back, and that's why he was holding the umbrella. But you know, that kind of corporate leadership, by the way, I'm not a fan of Coca-Cola, but I think in that case, somebody in town said, this is important for our city, to give a different kind of an image. And we could also talk about Houston and New Orleans. It's all now, so now, you know, 100 years ago, New Orleans was the most important city in the South, more important than Atlanta or Memphis or anywhere else. I still think New Orleans is a nice place to visit, but it's not an important city anymore. It's Houston. Same climate, same swamp, same humidity, but local decision makers. It's a little more complicated than that, but not a lot. We still rather go to New Orleans, but Houston ate it for lunch, as a matter of fact. So I think that's part of it. I think another local failure is urban renewal, and I don't know that any of us know the full story about Newark, but clearly College of Medicine and Dentistry, clearly the Columbus Homes, clearly the interstate highway. You know about the first ward, just blew the whole thing away, more or less. I mean, that's a shorthand thing. Associated with Louis Danzig, the head of the Newark Housing Authority. Look, New York had Robert Moses, and he was not a nice guy either. But Robert Moses, I think, maybe built better and built things that we needed, so that whatever you say about Moses, you know, you do it with a kind of grudging respect. Danzig seems not to have reached that level, so I think maybe urban renewal did more damage to Newark than Robert Moses did to New York. In fact, you could make the argument that Robert Moses was good for New York City. And so I think there's a big public failure. And probably also, and I have nothing against doctors, I need them, but I think probably, and this is, I'm putting myself far out on a limb here, but a big, huge medical complex surrounded by fences and just 1 or 2 entrances is not the same thing as a vibrant neighborhood, you know, where people drive in, park their car, guards are there and stuff like that. So I'm not sure that's as much of a net plus as a Lincoln Center might be, which is also an urban renewal project. I'm almost about to wind up. Then I think that we should also at least admit the failure of public safety. Too much corruption and police violence before 1970 and the 1967 disturbances, which flashed around the world as snipers and fires. Actually, now that we can look back with some dispassion and see, it's actually all the state police and the National Guard that kill people, but that's after the fact. Perception was important. The city seemed out of control. And then the corruption that's too often been part of the city government. I need not tell you about it. But I would say that New York City has not had a openly corrupt mayor since the late 1920s with Jimmy Walker. I mean, it would be kind of absurd to talk about Bloomberg stealing money or Giuliani. You may not like them, but I mean, they're not on the dole, or Ed Koch. Well, you know, our mayor here is not part of the group, but the last 3 mayors in Newark have been indicted, and a lot of other people have. And while in dollar terms, that's not a big thing, probably. But what it does to public perception is devastating. Devastating. It allows all those people elsewhere in New Jersey to say, they're just going to steal it anyway. So it makes no difference. So it's very important that we have a standard of probity and care and efficiency just because it builds up on other people their perception. So I think that no one really stepped up like Bob Woodruff of Coca-Cola in Atlanta, more like Henry Loeb in Memphis. So where are we now in Newark in 1912? Well, I would say there's some good news to this. Because individuals helped get us into this mess, maybe if it was just all national forces we could do nothing about, then hell, we might as well just go have a drink. But we can make a difference. The very fact that you're here is a good indication that you do care, that you do have a commitment to the city, to its health. And some cities are trying to turn it around. Youngstown, Ohio has said, look, we're never going to be the Youngstown we were of 170,000 or whatever. Let's be the best city of 60,000 that we can be. Or New Orleans seems to be, the jury is out, getting a little bit better. The Bronx. In the 1970s, when the Yankees were playing in the World Series and the Goodyear blimp was on over, Howard Cosell's there talking in the background, and there was an orange glow. The Bronx was burning. Burning. The Bronx lost as many people, and so did Brooklyn in the 1970s as Detroit did. Certainly looked like it was in every bit as much trouble as Newark in the 1970s. And by the way, crime is a huge issue. And we're not going to really get Newark out of the woods until we do better with crime. And I know that's an old story, and a hell of a lot easier for me to stand up here and when I have no responsibility for it. But I would say to you that the Bronx is not what most people's vision of paradise is. And the Bronx has a homicide rate, and has had, less than half of that of Newark for a long time. So, and it has the lowest, the poorest congressional district in the United States. So the fact that it's done a good job on crime should be a beacon for you. And Hoboken, look at Hoboken and what's happened there in recent years. So where will Newark go? It still has advantages. It's near Manhattan, which is important because it's a lot cheaper than Manhattan. It's only 15 minutes away. It has the transportation hub that Professor O'Flaherty would say is perhaps the greatest in the world. There, you've all seen it. Or the Turnpike and the main line of the railroad and Port Newark and the airport are all within 200 yards of each other. And certainly, Mayor Cory Booker has improved the perception of Newark. I won't stand up here and be a political shill for him, but perception is important. And certainly he's done a good job of reaching out to the American people. And those who are listening think, well, maybe something's happening in Newark, and that's important. And the Prudential Center and NJPAC are first class. I think, what can we, here's a historian, so I only talk about the past, but I do think there's several things that we could think about doing. Attract even more immigrants than we have. Newark's not bad in this regard. But I would suggest to you that American cities, they split. The cities that are really doing well now, Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Washington, have huge immigrant populations. The cities that are not doing well have very small immigrant. I'm talking about percentage-wise. St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, except for some Arabs. Newark is in the middle there. But I say Philadelphia, by the way, is not booming like New York City, and here's a statistic for it. Philadelphia is 11% foreign-born, and New York City is 37% foreign-born. Where is land more valuable? Where is the city more booming? It's obviously New York. You take the train into Philadelphia, you see these abandoned houses on the north side of Philadelphia. Newark. We know that the African-American population seems to be sliding back south to Atlanta. Stunning thing to me, all my life. $200,000 black folks between 2000 and 2010. That practically knocks you over. It knocks you over. We don't know for sure. Suburbs for sure. Atlanta for sure. But, you know, as a thing to base it on, we're not going to get so many newcomers from that element. So that's one thing. Second, sounds stupid, welcome gays and artists. There are people in New York, by the way, in Dumbo, they practically let the gays and artists stay for free because they tend not to commit as many street crimes. They tend to kind of like outdoor life and things like this. And so I know it's not easy, and I know we have some here in Newark. I'm not saying we don't, but that's a good group to start with. When you think about New York and you think about Soho, listen, you're often thinking about neighborhoods that the artists and gay people found first. Encourage outdoor restaurants. I was at the Prue Center the other day to watch the hometown Grizzlies take on the Nets. And as you come back on a relative, there are not so many chairs outside. I talked to a guy in New York City who's a developer, and I asked him, why did Columbus Avenue go from being a problem street to an elegant street or rich street in this course of 20 years? This guy said, outdoor restaurants. If you're walking down the street and you're kind of scared because it's dark and you hear laughter and clinking glasses nearby, you're not so scared anymore. And it doesn't cost anything. The problem is cities often charge them for it, as if we're doing them a favor to put stuff outside. In fact, they're doing the city a favor by showing you visibly, and especially here in a neighborhood with the college group. And we can encourage them more than they do now, stick around at night. And finally, reduce crime. Again, I would say to you, I don't think I said this before, Mexico City is a great city, huge city, but it's really not a great city. Sao Paulo is a huge city. It's not a great city. If businessmen go there, they go with armed guards. Johannesburg, South Africa is in many ways a blooming place, but Johannesburg is scary. If a city is going to do well, then that means it has to be safe. People have to feel their bodies are safe. So that's the last thing. At the end, I want to go back, if I can, to the Secretary of War and remind us what he said about Newark almost 100 years ago, and it can be still true. For an industrial community of magnitude, Newark has a beauty and attractiveness of its own. We have become a metropolis without ceasing to be provincial in the good sense of having something of the intimacy of village life. Thank you very much. As you do. So I think we should have a conversation. And we've even got the mayor here. So, and we've got all these other leaders here. And so what an opportunity in a small area to forget about me and think about the city and what we can do, because I know you all. So just put it in the form of a question rather than a speech.
Good evening. Thank you for good evening. Thank you for a very fine presentation. As you know, and as most of us Newarkers know, as I do, as a Newark resident and homeowner, one of the most controversial issues stewing these days is the fight over public education. That's one issue I didn't hear you address in your narrative this evening. Would you comment on the role that public education versus the issue of charter schools and how all of that might play in renewing a place like Newark?
I usually speak about New York City and what's happened in New York over the course. You want me to speak like this? I think, you want me to help?
Use the mic.
I'll use my mic, that's right. Okay. I usually talk about New York City, and it obviously has undergone a renaissance in the last 20 or 30 years. But I say that the renaissance of New York City will never be complete, or can't even be said to have really started well, until a family can say, we're going to put our 6-year-old daughter in the public schools and feel confident that she will be safe and well educated. And when people say inner city schools in the United States, we don't need to explain ourselves. We all know exactly what we're talking about. Now we have to change that perception, and we can. After all, it was only 20 years ago that we thought we could do nothing about crime. It's just going to get worse all the time. And it turned out we could do something about crime. Somebody's going to figure out what we can do about education to make it work, because not many people have a stake in keeping education bad. I do not have the answer, but I agree with you, it's critical. I'm a product mostly of public education. My wife was a retired public school teacher, but I guess the other side of that is it hasn't been working. So I know there's an argument both sides. One is, and New Orleans has essentially eliminated its public schools. They're gone. They're all charter schools. I mean, 5% or something like this. So I don't have the answer for you, sir, except to say that I think American cities are coming back. After all, who would have thought 25 years ago that there would be an NJPAC or a Prudential Center? I mean, this was a place you were trying to get the hell away from. Now, we don't know what to do with the Meadowlands. Who wants to be in the middle of a damn parking lot? So there are attitudes changing. And we hope that the schools will change, but that's a toughie. It's a real toughie. And I don't think any place in the United States has done it yet. But I'm confident that we will in the next 15 or 20 years. And I know that, Mark Zuckerberg, is that his name? Yeah. I know that some people have been expressing confidence, and I know there are issues between the unions and everybody else, and I don't know enough about it to get into that.
Talked about NJPACs with Victor Parsonette.
Thank you. I think the arts and culture have done a lot for Newark, and it's clearly a big difference. It's a topic you did not mention, and it's probably too long a topic to discuss, but you never mentioned drugs.
Drugs. And
not only in the local scene, but the national scene, and international, and Afghanistan, everywhere. What's the matter with legalizing it?
Well, again, I know you're a prominent physician. You know more about it than I do, and so I don't want to weigh in on it, except that to say this, that the main users of marijuana are white, and the main people who go to jail for it are black. I think that's probably a statement of fact. And that it's a big issue. I guess the argument I would make, though, is that New York City obviously has lots of drugs and lots of problems, but it's a lot less than it was 20 years ago. And all I can tell you is in my neighborhood, there are women out walking by themselves at midnight. Nobody even thinks about crime in New York City anymore. It's off the table. Now, there are things that Newark cannot easily do, because I think density, most of us grew up believing that density was a problem, And then what we wanted to do is move to the suburbs where you have a big yard and stuff like this. But safety is much more associated with density. What makes you feel safe in Manhattan is there are a lot of people looking at you. And so if I want to steal your purse or touch you inappropriately, but I don't want to be watched, it's a private act for me. In New York City, there's always a camera around to other people and stuff like this. So in some ways, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just if you get too frightened, the city actually becomes more dangerous because you stay inside. If you believe it, but once you get the ball rolling and get the outdoor restaurants out here across from Kilkenny Pub or whatever it's called, where people feel safe because there are other people out there walking, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's really what I think that we need to do. That's not going to solve the drug problem. But most of us, I'm sure physicians are in a different place, most of us just don't want the druggies to attack us. You know, that they're crazy enough to use the drugs. But we want them to stop and leave us alone. And I think we're beginning to, that's probably your thing, but I think we're beginning to get a handle on it. There are a lot of states that have legalized it now, and there's a move toward that. But I will tell you, and I will aggravate a lot of you, I think stop and frisk probably works. I'm sure the mayor doesn't want to get into this, but the truth is, in New York City, there were 2,200 homicides in 1992. Now there are about 500. There are fewer homicides in Manhattan since they've been keeping records. Now what that means is if you're a young kid and you want to carry a pistol and you go to the playground and somebody disses your girlfriend or your mother, what you used to do was shoot the sorry guy. You know, because you're angry. If my wife had a gun, she'd have killed me 20 times. But if the youngsters know that if they urinate on the street, jaywalk, drink a beer outside, that a policeman has the excuse now to put them against the wall and search them, and they find a gun, it's a felony. So what they do is leave the gun home in their underwear drawer, or as some of the gangs do, leave it in a locker where they can know the combination and go get it. But if you diss me and I want to kill you, now I've got to go home, got to go to the locker or go home and get my gun. On the way, I think, you know, you do deserve to die and you are an ass. But is it worth it for me to spend the next 20 years in jail for your sorry self? And I begin to think about it. Meanwhile, the other person sitting there on the bench says, Ken Jackson is a fool. Am I going to stand here and wait for him to come back with a gun to shoot me? So meanwhile, I'll go somewhere else. How else do you explain 1,500, more than 1,500 black males are alive every year because of that? I think. Now, I agree, admittedly, it's not me that's being stopped and frisked, and then you do a better job, but something is getting the guns off the streets so that people are not killing each other willy-nilly like that as much as they used to. And those are statistics. The reason we trust homicide, we can't trust rape, we can't trust robbery, we can't trust burglary, because who the hell knows? But two statistics. Homicide is kind of hard, and by the way, it's not perfect either. It's like 97%. Or automobile theft, of which I didn't mention. Newark was the obvious automobile theft capital of the world. But everybody reported it. You cannot get your insurance company to pay you unless you have a police report. And you can't deduct it off Schedule B. So it doesn't matter if there are 8 people in front of you, you're going to just sit there and suck it up and get that report. But every other, so those numbers are down 75%. Yes, sir. Just speak up, because we don't.
My name is Jacques. I live in Newark. My family and I have lived in the city for 160 years. It's one of the oldest people living here.
You probably are.
I don't mean it that way. I just turned 70. Thank you for coming to Newark and your research, your study of Newark. You've done a great job on it. A couple of things I could say some things on, but just 2 things. Mr. Bamberger, Macy's owned Bamberger since 1929. I don't know if you're aware of that. And the parades and all were probably Macy backed and things like that. Mr. Bamberger
I did not know they owned it that early. I knew they did later, but
yeah, Mr. Bamberger was one of those people who never got the proper recognition of the city that he should. There should be a plaque, a monument, a statue of him in one of these parks down here. He bought and gave the land to the Newark Museum and funded that himself, put much of his collection into that in the very beginning. That's what I'll say about that. No mayor, and I've lived in Newark my whole life, no mayor since the 1960s has done more to improve the city than Mayor Cory Booker. And he doesn't get the proper recognition he deserves from some of the people in Newark. There's an entrenched group of people in the central and south wards who are still against him. They still resent him and still favor Mayor Sharp James, and I knew Sharp James too. But nobody has done more to bring Newark into the future than Mayor Cory Booker.
Okay, I do think you're giving a speech now, so what's the question?
No, that was, I'm just
all right,
making some comments. Thank you.
I do think this is an assertion I'm making that I don't have that I hope that some of you will contact. I do not think that the Newark business leadership after World War II took enough of an interest in the city, whether it was the Chamber of Commerce, the Newark Club, the Essex County Club, the whatever it was. It seems to me that Newark got a little bit, relative to Atlanta, relative to Chicago, where a place could do it. So it's, it's kind of like a straw man, but Bamberger, whether he owned the store or not, seemed to have been the kind of municipal leader who had money, who recognized that he had made his money in the city of Newark, and as you said, Clement, I need to pay something back. It's been good to me. A lot of people, Newark was good to a lot of people. Did they pay it back? Did they say, we owe the city for something? It was responsible for our shoe store or whatever it was. Again, that's an easy assertion to make. Yes, I think I see somebody.
Okay. I want to tie together two things you mentioned. First, geographic size, and second, perception. Newark is very small, as you point out.
Very small, okay.
Very small. And my brother lives near Houston. Every time a suburb reached a certain size, they annexed it. And that's how they became enormous. I live in Vailsburg, which is surrounded on three sides by other municipalities. East Orange and Irvington are plainly much more distressed than Newark. Isn't this a good time to approach them about annexation? Plus, Harrison has taken on an enormous debt burden in building Red Bull Arena and some apartment complexes. Would they might they not also be interested in annexation?
That's probably
one other point. Taxes. A friend of mine in Belleville has taxes almost twice as high as mine, and the guy I was talking to on jury duty in Irvington has taxes twice and more than mine.
Well, I think those are good observations, and I don't disagree with them. It might be a good time to try to get some other. But even if Newark included all of Essex County, it would be a relatively small city. Do you know that? It's not a big place. Essex County is not big. Houston has 400 and something square miles. All of Essex is 120 or something like that. So it's not like we'd have an enormous city if we had all of Essex County. But that is and that's one of those decisions made in the past. It's very hard to correct, but maybe there's some way to do it. And by the way, Brooklyn just barely joined New York City. And I mean, their vote was like 0.001% majority. But Brooklyn has done better, but just for being part of New York City, because New York City subsidizes the outer boroughs. The place that would do the best if it was seceding would be Manhattan. I mean, it's carrying Staten Island and lots of other places, if you follow what I'm saying there.
I was called to a southern city to speak to a group of civic leaders. I won't name it, but you are very familiar with it. And I was amazed that it was 800 people showed up for me to talk about some of the strategies that we were doing in Newark, having heard about what was going on. And then I was asked to go into a back room with about 20 civic leaders from this southern city, and they all bemoaned to me the fact that they had a hard time finding people to get into the political world. As I look around America right now, I see in San Francisco, I see in New York, very diverse groups of people that are running for civic leadership. And in Newark, and this is not a criticism, we have some great families that have been dominating the political landscape for a long time, but we have a problem in America, I think, that many people are choosing not to go into politics at all, and that sphere of creative dynamic leadership that might bring other skill sets into the political world is becoming incredibly shallow. And so for cities like Newark, where we have incredible leaders in this city, many of them you will never see their names on a ballot running for office. And that, to me, even though now we have a diverse population of great talented people in my generation, even the millennials, 20-somethings and 30-somethings, very few of them are looking to politics as a way to offer leadership. And I think that's a problem in Newark, and I think that's a problem in many other smaller cities that just don't see the caliber of leaders coming from other sectors that we often see.
Well, I think those are very prescient comments, and obviously most of us could not stand up to the scrutiny of elective office. Certainly I could not, and therefore, not that anybody's asking me, but I think you're exactly right. But I do want to make the point that Newark does have this advantage. First of all, it has a very visible and articulate mayor, but more than that, its relatively small size makes it possible that you could get the leadership into a room. The business leadership is still here, but that's essentially what Atlanta did, is get everybody who says, look, we can either fight about the pie, or we can try to make the pie bigger for all of us. Now, we clearly don't all have the same interest, but one interest we do have is to make Atlanta grow and prosper. And if it does, by the way, those thousands of blacks from Chicago, a lot of them going to Atlanta now, because they're thinking Atlanta's doing well. So I think getting a conversation going honestly, probably not in a public venue like this, saying, look, we've got a problem. We've got a perception problem. We've got a reality problem. What can we do? What can we do for all of us to make it work for all? Because most of us are not going to benefit. I would say relatively few people have benefited as Newark sank in the last 40 years. Listen, I've got all these things that I collected for, which I'm sure y'all are familiar with, where, what are these auction things? Where I could buy houses in Newark for $100, $25 down and stuff. We want to stop that. Everybody loses in Detroit. You know, the average house in Detroit is under $10,000. You've got to create demand, because what you're doing is hurting the local people. They've done everything. Think of all those people in Newark who've done everything right all their lives, paid their bills, cut their grass, made their mortgage payments. If the city, by the way, the suburbs too. In Detroit, you think the suburbs aren't hurting? They have some of the most beautiful suburbs in the world in Detroit. And the prices of all of them are down. Because the city, its image affects everything. We've got to realize that we're all in this together. In a region like Newark, all of Essex County, all of these other things, it's kind of one economy. By the way, New York too. There's no such, and I think the suburbs need to prosper. You can't have a great city without great suburbs, but you sure as heck can't have great suburbs without.
And on that, can I ask, just add a last addendum to my question, because I think that's what a lot of sort of urban analysts are now saying, that forget cities, talk about regions now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that the fact that Detroit is isolated and on its own is a reason why it's not succeeding. Newark now, its population is rising for the first time in 60 years. Companies are coming back. And what they'll say is that they're not only attracted to all the incredible things champions in this room have helped to make happen in our city, but they're also becoming a part of a great metropolitan area.
Well, I mean, you could almost think of a way, one way might be emphasize that you're part of New York City. You know, the greatest city in the world or whatever. We're right here. How many minutes are you away?
Spoken like a real New Yorker.
Yeah. No, but you know, okay, I think I've come to the end of the line. Thank you very much.